Greetings and welcome back to the lesson. The topic is public sector procurement. We're still on the subject advanced public financial management. Today we're going to focus our attention on the accountable documents applied in public procurement. Now, candidates, the Public Procurement and Disposal Act and the associated public procurement and disposal regulations have important provisions for procurement record keeping and management. And the regulations and the law requires an accounting officer to ensure that procurement plans are prepared in conformity with the medium-term fiscal framework and fiscal policy objectives, and that are submitted to the National Treasury. So that's a requirement of the law, that an accounting officer is required to ensure that procurement plans are prepared. To ensure procurement plans, to ensure that the procurement plans are in conformity. The procurement plans should be in conformity with the medium-term fiscal framework. To ensure procurement plans are in conformity with the medium-term fiscal framework and fiscal objectives, and that are submitted to the National Assembly. It is also required to ensure proper documentation. The accounting officer is required to ensure proper documentation of procurement proceedings. Proper documentation of procurement proceedings, and also the safe custody of all procurement records in accordance with the Act. And custody of all records. Now, do you understand, candidates? The regulations and the law are very specific, are very clear on accountable documents. The accounting officer is mandated by law to ensure that procurement plans are in conformity with the medium-term fiscal framework and fiscal objectives, and that has to be done in conformity with the medium-term fiscal framework. It is also the role of the accounting officer to ensure proper documentation of procurement proceedings and also the custody of all procurement records. Are you following? So, the regulations also requires an accounting officer to prepare an annual procurement plan. To prepare an annual procurement plan. An annual procurement plan which is realistic and in a format set out in regulations. Now here in Kenya, these regulations are mainly contained in what we call subsidiary legislation, where the Act empowers the Cabinet Secretary to develop regulations that can help in the operationalization of the Act. So this annual procurement plan should be not only realistic, but it ought to be prepared in a format that is set out in regulations. All right? The regulations are within the approved budget, and that has to be prior to commencement of each financial year as part of the annual budget preparation process. So candidates, we are studying accountable documents. Moving on, the records should be kept for at least the records. We're saying here that an accounting officer of a procuring entity should keep records for each procurement for at least 6 years after the resulting contract has been completed. 6 years. After a contract has completed, the accounting officer is required to keep records of that contract for at least 6 years. Or if no contract resulted, because if the contract succeeded and the contract was delivered, then after it's delivered, then there is need to keep these records for at least 6 years. But where the contract did not succeed, if no contract resulted, then it should be after the procurement proceedings are terminated. All right? After procurement proceedings are terminated, that is until when that should be maintained. Do you understand? After the procurement proceedings were terminated. Now, the records of procurement may include a brief description. The records may include, one, a brief description. This is a brief description of the goods. Okay? We are talking about procuring of goods, procuring of services, procuring of works, services, procurement of goods, procurement of services, procurement of works, and so on. So the contracts include a brief description of goods, works, or services procured. 2, another record that is required is if a procedure other than open tendering was used, the reason for doing so. If procedure other than tendering was used, the reasons for doing so. We know the normal procedure is tendering process, but if for any other reason that tendering was not used, then there has to be a record showing or indicating the reasons for not using the tendering procedure. C, copy of advertisements. Copy of advertisements. Now, if as part of the procurement procedure anything was advertised in newspapers or other publication, then a copy of that advertisement as it appeared in the newspaper or publication should be maintained. A copy. Take a copy of it, then have it as part of the procurement records. Copy of advertisements. Three, name and address of the person making submissions. Name and address of the person making the submissions. 5, the price. The price or basis of determining the price, and a summary of other principal terms and conditions of the tender. The price or basis for determining the price. Principle, let me have it as a separate point. Terms and conditions of a tender. Principal terms and conditions of a tender, of the tender. Principal what? Terms and conditions of the tender, or terms and conditions of, mainly the terms and conditions of the tender. It could be also quotation or proposals. Summary of proceedings. Summary of what? Summary of proceedings of the opening of tenders, the evaluation and comparison of tenders, the proposals or quotations, including the evaluation criteria used as prescribed. When making evaluation, there are proceedings and minutes have to be taken during evaluation of tenders, so there has to be summary of proceedings of the opening of tenders, of opening of tenders. Now, in public finance video lectures, I laid out the entire tendering process in the public sector. And we went through each and every stage. What happens at each and every stage? There is this stage known as opening of tenders. Now, even before the opening of tenders, we saw how the submissions are made, how the tenders are dropped into the tender box. And we even saw before the box is placed in that room, there has to be access to the room. We say that the door should be opened. It should be a specific place at a given date. There ought to be a place where the tenders are submitted. It's called a tender box. We even saw how if a tender documents are larger, such that they cannot fit into the box, we saw what should happen. So the law lays out all the procedures that have been must be followed in the tendering process. So one of the documents that is required is a summary of proceedings of opening of tenders. Proceedings. There could have been tender documents that didn't fit, or there could be tenders that are received by post. There are tenders that could be opened before they are dropped into the tender box. So all what happens, the proceedings of opening of tenders, that's a document. It's a summary of proceedings of opening of tenders. There are also proceedings at evaluation and comparison of tenders. There also to be a summary in relation to evaluation, okay, of tenders. Summary of proceedings of evaluation of tenders. In fact, there ought to be a tender committee. The tender committee should comprise of not less than 3 people, and there ought to be all the proceedings during that evaluation of tenders should be minuted and so on. So there ought to be a summary of proceedings. This is a document that is also required to be maintained. And if the procurement proceedings were terminated without resulting in a contract, then there ought to be an explanation why they were terminated. Explanation why they were terminated. I'm saying if the procurement proceedings were terminated, procurement proceedings were terminated, there has to be a document explaining why procurement proceedings were terminated. That is, if the procurement proceedings were terminated without resulting in a contract, there ought to be an explanation of why they were terminated. So these are some of the documents, accountable documents. And candidates, a copy of every document that is required by the Act must be prepared. A copy of every document that the Act requires. And these are some of the documents. Must be prepared by the procuring entity. And there could also be any such information or documents as prescribed by the Act. And I said earlier that an accounting officer of a procuring entity is required to maintain proper filing system with clear links between procurement and expenditure files. And what do you think that is important? Why is it important that the accounting officer, why do you think the accounting officer of the procuring entity should maintain proper filing system with links between procurement and expenditure? Why? It is for the simple reason that such kind of filing system and links between the procurement and expenditure, such kind of information facilitates what we call an audit trail. Because all these procedures at some point are required to be put under scrutiny. There is an external party that may be required to scrutinize all these processes. And that could be the work of the Auditor General or the Internal Audit Department. All right? So that will mark the end of the lesson. We've been studying accountable documents. We've highlighted what is required of an accounting officer. We've listed the documents. Number 1 is a brief description of goods, works or services that are being procured. If procedure other than tendering is used, there ought to be reasons. There should be a document showing reasons for doing so. In case there were any advertisements in the newspapers, then a copy of the advertisements should also be provided as a document, as an accountable document, where there were advertisements. If as part of the procurement procedure anything was advertised in a newspaper or any other publication, then a copy of that advertisement as it appeared in that newspaper or publication ought to be maintained. Then there is the name and address of a person making submissions, the ones who are making submissions for consideration in tendering. The price is required. Principal terms and conditions of the tender required. Summary of proceedings of opening of tenders. There is a summary of proceedings of evaluation of tenders. Then explanations why procurement proceedings were terminated. If in case proceedings were terminated without resulting in a contract, then an explanation why they were terminated has to be provided. So thank you for attending the lesson. We will meet in our next lesson where we continue to share knowledge in public finance. Bye-bye.